Now, anthropologists are scientists of a sort, and like all scientists, they love to classify things. In the study of ritual, there have been a whole bunch of systems developed for classifying different types. Rites, ceremonies, cyclical rituals, annual rituals, and so on and so on. I really don't want to worry about that here. But there is one type of ritual that anthropologists study a lot, and it's worth looking at in a little bit of detail. It's called a rite of passage, also known as a rite of transition, a ritual that marks a change from one social status to another. Now, many of these are what we call life cycle rituals, which mark your progress through the stages of life. The transition from the womb to life in the world may be celebrated through a baptism, or a naming ceremony, or a circumcision ritual, or a presentation to a temple or community. Most societies mark the transition from childhood to the age when you're eligible to be married, often called a coming-of-age ceremony. In rural Denmark, for example, this was traditionally marked by the confirmation ceremony at the age of 14. After your confirmation, you would either start working as a farmhand or move into advanced education. You got some of the legal rights of adults, and you could start thinking about getting married. In many societies, there are initiation rituals associated with coming of age, which are supposed to teach young men and women the information they need to function as adults. Some of this information is sexual, and some of it has to do with magic and other secret knowledge specific to the two genders. In contemporary American society, the advancing age of marriage and the decline of sexual differentiation has made our coming-of-age rituals a little less dramatic. Many American Christians are still confirmed at age 14, while Jewish children have a bar or bat mitzvah at age 13. But they don't really have a lot of effect on anything that happens in their larger lives. The real transition ritual to adulthood for most Americans comes a bit later, in the graduation from high school, or even the graduation from college. Now, we also mark the transition from single to married with a wedding ceremony, as well as a variety of other stages in the life cycle afterwards. Birthday parties mark the passage of years. Silver and golden anniversary parties mark large passages of time. Recognition parties for being in a job for a set amount of years happen, as do retirement parties when you move from being employed to no longer being employed. And of course, we have a transition from being a living person to being a dead person, the funeral. Now, what makes rites of passage so interesting is that they tend to be similar in just about all societies anthropologists have looked at. Not similar in their content. That's very different from one place to another. They look different. The similarity is in their structure, in the way that the process of these rituals is organized. Given how few universal things you find in human culture, the regularity of life cycle rituals has been the subject of a great deal of interest for cultural anthropology. Now, how do we make sense of these rituals, these rites of passage? Well, there are three general ways we do this, three frameworks for understanding them: structural, psychological, and perceptual. Let's say a little bit about each of those. A structural analysis looks at the shape of a ritual and what that shape communicates. Rites of passage tend to say a lot, to be full of a lot of significance, because they occur at times when a lot needs to be said. Let's take an example of a wedding. In fact, let's take the example of my wedding, which happened over 30 years ago in Boston, back when I had a lot more hair and a lot fewer pounds. My wife and I were married at Memorial Chapel, a big non-denominational church right in the middle of the Harvard campus. Here is a very simple schematic drawing of the layout. It was more complex than this, but this gives you the idea. There was a big rectangular room with a bunch of pews going up the length of it for people to sit in. There was an aisle down the center and a raised platform called a dais up at the front. There was a door at the back where you came in, and another door, a small one up front, that led to the minister's study up here. All in all, it was a pretty standard layout for a Protestant church in New England. Now, suppose for a moment that you came into this room as a guest of the wedding. You would enter at the back door over here, where you would be greeted by one of the ushers, a young man, one of my roommates, in a badly fitting tuxedo, who would lead you down the aisle and show you where to sit. When he did that, he would ask you two questions. The first would be, bride or groom? If you said bride, meaning that you were connected somehow with the bride in the wedding, he would sit you on the left side of the aisle over here. If you said groom, he would sit you on the right side of the aisle over here. He would also ask you friend or family. If you said that you were a family member, say the bride's uncle, he would sit you up front over here. If, on the other hand, you said that you're the groom's best friend's landlord's brother's former roommate, you would be seated somewhere back here, or perhaps outside the building altogether. Now, this would happen for person after person coming into the building until the place filled up. Now, once all the guests were seated, the ushers retreated back to the room, where I was sitting with the best man and the minister, both of whom were trying very hard to keep me from fainting. We stood there all together for a couple of minutes, and then some music sounded on the organ, and the minister led us out in a line to stand here. He himself went up onto the platform here. We all turned to the back and watched as a series of young women entered the room. These were the various bridesmaids who walked one at a time through these doors, down the aisle, and up to the platform, where they stood in a row here. Finally, along came the bride, taking the same route, but with her mother and her father walking on either side of her. They walked all the way to the end, then sat down here, while she joined me up here. We then all turned to the front, and the various readings started. Now freeze things right there. What do we have in the layout of this ritual? By having people come in and arrange themselves this way, what have we created? We have created, really, a schematic map of the social group that is being created by this ritual. Remember, a wedding ritual is about creating a new social group. The bride and the groom, of course, are becoming a couple, but everyone else in this room is involved as well. All of these people are becoming relatives, in-laws in most cases, and they expect to have some sort of connection with each other through this wedding for many years to come. The two sets of parents will one day share grandchildren. The brothers and sisters-in-law expect to have some sort of contact with one another, even if it's not very extensive. That's a confusing thing to think about, and honestly a little unnerving. There is something new being created here, and it's natural to wonder how you fit in. Well, in the wedding ritual, you know. This is a diagram with two dimensions. The horizontal dimension here reflects your closeness to the marrying couple. The closer you are to the front, the closer you are to them. The further back you are, the further away you are. The left and right dimension shows whether you're in the bride's family or the groom's family. Not only that, these rows tend to be organized in order of importance. Everyone wants to be close to the aisle, so they can see the happy couple coming in and out. So the more important people tend to be oriented more toward the center. That's the same with the bridesmaids and the groomsmen, with the maid of honor and the best man standing closest to the couple. The structure of this event mirrors the structure of the social world that it creates, and it tells you where in that world you fit in. That's one of the things that's so important about ritual, even if we perceive it unconsciously rather than consciously. In most of life, people are kind of confused, unsure about where they fit in. Where do I belong in my family? In my friendship group? In my community? Who really knows? That's especially true at a time of change, when who we are and where we fit in is suddenly different and unstable. That creates confusion and anxiety, worries about who we are. But in this ritual, for this moment, you know exactly where you fit. I am in row 4, seat 3, on the groom's side, behind Uncle Fred, but ahead of Cousin Ralph. For this one moment, I know exactly who I am. That's one of the reasons these rituals are so important and why you really feel it if you miss one. If you take nothing else at all from this lecture, remember this: never miss a funeral, never miss a wedding, never miss a graduation. If you do, the transition that has been made will never feel entirely real to you, and you won't have that clarifying experience that the ritual can provide. Now, that's an example of structural analysis of rituals. I'm just going to talk very briefly about the two other approaches, psychological and processual, because I don't want to keep you in this all day. I wish I had more time on it, though, because the analysis of ritual is absolutely one of my favorite parts of anthropology. Now, psychological approaches. Transitions aren't just confusing categorically, They're also confusing emotionally. When you go from one social position to another, there are a lot of things you need to feel. I mean, birth is presumably confusing for the person who is experiencing it. We can't really ask them. But it's also confusing for the new parents who have to adjust to a new social role and a new person in their lives. When someone close to you dies, it's not only a sad occasion, it's a confusing occasion, as you have to work out the conflicting emotions you have for the person. If someone's close to you, you love them, of course, but there are also things about them that drive you crazy. And when they die, it can be difficult to bring those together in your mind. You also have to work out who you are and how life is going to change when death has blown a hole in it. Transitions are hard for us to work out, especially alone. Ritual structures that for us, giving us a context to feel specific things and a place to express them. Think about a funeral and some of the things that go on in it. Different cultures have different kinds of funerals, of course, so these won't apply to everyone. But at many American funerals, there's a wake, sometimes referred to as calling hours, when people can come to visit the family and quietly express their feelings of loss. Then there's a funeral ceremony in a church or a chapel, where you have a chance to think about some of the religious and existential questions that come up when someone's died. After that, there's a burial and interment, during which you see the person go into the ground and often for the first time come to terms with the fact that he or she is really gone. And after that, in most cases, there's a reception, where there's food and conversation, and often a lot of laughter, to give people a chance to emerge back into life at a time when you've been immersed in death. In a sense, what a funeral does is to walk you through the emotions that you need to feel after someone has died. Right? That makes it very important to us. And again, I strongly recommend that you go to them when they come up in your family. The same thing is true for a wedding or a graduation or whatever. If you skip one of these, you may miss a long and difficult day, and maybe you'll save some money on travel expenses. But you may never really come to terms with the confusing emotions associated with it. And you may find that you'll never be able to fully believe that it's actually happened. The other thing I want to mention was processual analysis. Processual analysis looks at the process of ritual, the way it unfolds over time. Now, this is a very abstract way of looking at ritual, and it's the place where you see the strongest and some of the most surprising similarities across cultures. The idea behind processual analysis is that in some ways, transition is dangerous. Society is, after all, really a system of differences. Society defines people as belonging to different genders, to different classes, to different age groups, different occupations. Social structure involves a set of categories that define things that make people different from one another. This is an essential part of any society, and it's a basic part of the way people think about each other. It's also, I should mention, something that we do with other things besides people, right? Culture divides time up into weeks and months and years and so on. We divide territory up into my territory and your territory, this country, that country, and so on. These are basic parts of the way that culture operates. But at a deep level, it's all an illusion. It's all culturally constructed. The categories we use could be different, and in other cultures they are. So part of what culture has to do is to hide that, to create a feeling of reality around what are really arbitrary and artificial classifications. Now, in that context, transition is a dangerous point. When a person goes from being one thing to being another, you can see pretty clearly that it's the same person. We say that he or she is now something else, but that's obviously a bit of a pretense. That insight threatens to expose the arbitrariness of the entire system of classifications. Now, to protect itself from that, in a way, culture has to do something special at those times, something to show that the person really is different, that something profound and real has actually happened, right? Rites of passage confer a sense of objective reality on something that is in fact arbitrary. Now, one way to think of this in terms of time. You go through your life in a continuous way, moving along a line from the past to the future, and it feels pretty smooth. Each moment connects to the next moment, and you feel like the same person the whole time, maybe changing in little increments, but not all at once. As you do that, though, you sometimes go through changes, cultural changes, that you're told alter the kind of person you are. You go from being a child to being an adult, from being a student to being a graduate, from being a single person to being a married person, from being a child to being a parent. That requires a break in the timeline, a moment when you go from being one thing to being another. You need to come out of ordinary time, change, and then re-enter ordinary time as someone new. Now that, in a sense, is what rituals of passage do. They cut out a little segment of time to create a before and an after in which you are different things. During the ritual, you stand outside of normal time, and that has some symbolic implications. Now, processual analysis argues that you can divide transition rituals into 3 stages. The first stage, called separation, involves pulling the person out of normal time. The third stage, reaggregation, reincorporates the person back into it. The middle stage, the liminal stage, is a sort of time out of time, a moment when you're betwixt and between, neither one nor the other. And that's where some of the most interesting things in transition rituals tend to occur. Think back on that wedding and about the person of the woman getting married. Right, in American weddings, they're really about the bride. We have brides magazines. We don't have grooms magazines. The father of the bride pays for the wedding simply because in most cases the father of the groom wouldn't bother. The bride wears a special dress different from somebody else. The groom wears the same clothing all the other grooms wear because, frankly, they're pretty much interchangeable. Think about the transition that's being made by the bride in this wedding. When she walks down the aisle, the separation phase, her position in the family is as a daughter, right? She is the daughter of these parents, and that's emphasized by the fact that she walks down the aisle with the support of her father and mother. When she goes back, the reaggregation phase, she's a wife. That's emphasized by the fact that she's walking with her husband, on her husband's arm, as she goes back down. In the middle, though, is the liminal phase, up at the altar, when she's neither a daughter nor a wife. For that moment, she's a bride, which is neither one nor the other. Now, what's really fascinating about the ritual process is the symbolic regularities you find in this. In almost all rites of passage, for example, the phases of separation and reaggregation are constructed as opposites. In separation, the bride walks in one direction. In reaggregation, she walks in the opposite direction. In separation, she walks very formally, with that slow step that they teach brides for weddings, and her hands are clasped in front of her. In reaggregation, she's walking briskly and lightly, with her hands waving to the crowd. In separation, the music is slow and rising. Dum dum da dum, dum dum da dum, dum dum da dum, dum da dum. I can't sing. But in reaggregation, it's fast and falling. Dum dum da dum 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 dum. Right. The most interesting part of all is the liminal phase, because that's a time when ordinary structures don't apply. Think about New Year's, for example, a moment that marks a transition between one year and the next. At just about every New Year's party, you'll notice a transition in the music that's played, right? Leading up to the moment, separation, the music is really pretty contemporary, right? Pop stars singing solos with a lot of electronic instrumentation. That's the separation phase. After New Year's has officially come, you have the opposite, right? During reaggregation. A very old song, traditional, All Lang Syne by Robert Burns, sung not by a soloist, but by all the people at the party together, slowly and without much of any instrumentation. And in between, at exactly midnight, during the liminal moment, when the old year is gone and the new one hasn't quite arrived, what do you get? Not new music, not old music, but noise. Sound without any structure, horns and crackers and noisemakers that defy any kind of organization. Liminality is the place for anti-structure, for chaos. And in many cases, it's the place for danger and for magic. Now, I'm going to stop here because if I don't, I'll go on about this for the rest of the day. Ritual analysis is actually one of my favorite things about anthropology, and the examples you can choose to discuss are practically limitless. The main point, though, is a pretty straightforward one. Rituals are all around us, both in religious contexts and in our everyday life. There's a reason for that. Rituals serve important functions for us, both socially and psychologically, and they contain enormous amounts of cultural symbolism and meaning. The more you look at them, the more you analyze them, the more you understand them, the more meaning and the more complexity you find.